Please welcome AAP California Chapter 2 Newsletter Editorial Board member, Dr. Niru Maduri.
Good morning, and thank you. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Reshma Shah. Dr. Shah is a board-certified pediatrician, mother, plant-based home cook, teacher, perpetual student, and co-author of the award-winning book, Nourish, the definitive plant-based nutrition guide for families. She currently serves as an instructor for Stanford's Healthy Living program and oversees the nutrition curriculum for the Stanford University Pediatric Integrative Medicine Fellowship. Dr. Shah received teaching awards from Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital at Case Western Reserve University and School of Medicine in Cleveland, and from Stanford University School of Medicine. So please welcome Dr. Reshma Shah as she provides perspective on the health advantages of plant-based diets for children.
Thank you. It really is such an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you today. And I'm going to be talking about climate, food, and health. I think food sits at the center of so many of the conversations that matter most to us. It reveals a story about our culture, our traditions, and even our values. And today I want to extend that conversation by creating a framework around food that also connects it to both human and planetary health. And I'm going to start by revealing the punchline right from the start, which is that shifting towards a plant-based diet is a key solution for improved health outcomes, mitigating climate change, and creating a more just and equitable society. But I think before we can begin the conversation, it's really important to acknowledge that food is a deeply personal issue. In working with students, residents, and families, I've come to realize that when you ask a person about their food, you enter into an intimate conversation, because what a person tells you about the food that they eat and feed their family tells you a story about their life. It speaks to issues of culture, tradition, access, privilege, and ultimately identity. And one of the things that I've learned along the way is that curiosity is a much more effective tool than judgment. And I say this just to share my intention that I hope to provide an inviting and open conversation that can help us move towards positive change. And because I started by sharing that food is such a deeply personal issue, I think it's only fair for me to share a little bit about my own food story. So this is a photograph of my parents when they first immigrated to the United States from India. And growing up, I ate a fairly traditional Indian diet from the Gujarat region of India. Even though we didn't really call it at the time, it was a predominantly plant-based diet that focused on vegetables, grains, and of course, legumes. We grew up in a fairly typical suburban neighborhood. And so as I got older, a lot of the more standard American fare made an increasing appearance in my diet. And so for much of my young adult life, I ate what I would call a healthy-ish omnivorous diet. During my medical education and residency training, I received very little education in terms of nutrition and essentially nothing in terms of the health effects of climate change or even the social determinants of health. It's when I became a parent and also started seeing my own patients that I started to think more deeply about the impacts of food on our health, on our climate, and our communities. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. As healthcare professionals, I think that these conversations are likely to present themselves to us in two specific ways. First of all, your patients will be coming to you for guidance. With the increasing awareness of food's impact on both climate and health, more and more families are moving towards plant-predominant diets, and they're looking to us to provide them with compassionate care that's evidence-based. The second is that with the increasing rates of diet-related chronic diseases and the effects of climate change, as pediatricians, we are a trusted voice and we can actually be activists in this space. So for today's conversation, I'm going to start with a couple of key definitions. Then I'll discuss food's impact on climate and the importance of plant-based diets as a pivotal part of the solution in addressing the climate crisis. I'm then going to shift gears briefly and talk about the health advantages of plant-based diets. And then finally, I'll leave you with some actionable steps that you can put into practice in your own homes and kitchens, and even in your own practices. So the first definition I want to share is the definition of a sustainable diet. So according to the Food and Agricultural Association of the United Nations, sustainable diets are those diets with low environmental impacts which contribute to food and nutrition security and to healthy life for present and future generations. This diagram is a representation of sustainable diets from the FAO. In addition, sustainable diets should also be protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems. They should be culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair, and affordable. They should also be nutritionally adequate, safe, and healthy. Sustainable diets aim to prevent all forms of malnutrition, from undernutrition, micronutrient deficiency, as well as overweight and obesity. They should also reduce the risk of diet-related non-communicable diseases and improve population-level health, reduce hunger and food insecurity, while also promoting economic development and environmental protection. And as if this weren't a tall enough order to fill, I would personally add that this definition of sustainable diets should also address animal welfare. So the second definition I wanted to share has to do with the central theme of this talk, which is the definition of a plant-based diet. There is no single definition of a plant-based diet. On one end of the spectrum, you have flexitarian or semi-vegetarian diets, which are predominantly plant-based, but do include some animal foods in the diet, to pescatarian, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, all the way to vegan or pure vegetarian diets, which exclude all animal foods in the diet. And a person's intentions or goals may influence their specific diet. So for instance, someone following a vegan diet looking to exclude animal foods in the diet might primarily be motivated by climate change or animal welfare. And these types of diets may or may not be health promoting, depending on the quality of the foods that are consumed. For instance, heavily processed foods like sugar sweetened beverages are technically plant-based or vegan, but most of us would agree that they're not necessarily health promoting. Dietary guidelines are meant to guide us to make healthy food choices and serve as a science-based foundation for vital nutrition policies and programs. But increasingly, dietary guidelines are also prioritizing planetary health. And I would argue that pediatric dietary guidelines that don't specifically address the greatest existential threat of our lifetimes, and certainly the lifetimes of our children, are not only inadequate and insufficient, but perhaps even negligent. So we're becoming acclimated to the daily barrage of news centered around the climate crisis, whether it's the California wildfires, the heat dome in the Pacific Northwest, floods in Europe and China, and droughts that have introduced the term climate refugee into our lexicon. There is no denying that the climate crisis is real, alarming, and acute. Children, the elderly, and other vulnerable communities, including lower income families and communities of color, are harmed more by climate change. They're often the most directly impacted by climate change, even though they're the least responsible for its causes. And for those of you that are interested in learning more about pediatric health impacts of climate change, I would urge you to read the American Academy of Pediatrics position statement on global climate change and children's health. In it, they emphasize that climate change poses threats to human health, safety, and security, and children are uniquely vulnerable to these threats. Although uncertainties may remain regarding risks and appropriate policy response, failure to take prompt, substantive action, given our current knowledge, would be an act of injustice to all children. In fact, the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released in 2021 doesn't sound a new alarm, but just a louder one with the hopes of inciting action. The IPCC report asserts that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, land, and the UN Secretary actually described these findings as a code red for humanity, requiring immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Excuse me, sorry about that. Got ahead of myself. Okay. I think the causes and solutions around climate change are complex. I'm not a climate scientist, but I do know that as individuals, as communities, and institutions, we can do many, many things that matter. There was a recent publication which identified 4 of the highest impact things that an individual can do to tackle climate change. And these include to avoid air travel, to live car-free, to have fewer children, and of course, to eat a plant-based diet. And I think that many of these mitigating solutions may seem highly impractical. For instance, 85% of Americans drive to work, or even irrelevant. Most of us sitting here are not actively in the process of deciding whether or not to have another child. But shifting towards a plant-based diet provides one of the most immediate and meaningful ways that we can protect our planet. Food and agriculture's effect on climate is complex and multifaceted, and the estimates for animal agriculture's impact on greenhouse gas emissions can vary dramatically, from as low as 16.5% to as high as 51%, depending on what's used in the calculations. But even at the low end of the estimates, animal agriculture contributes more greenhouse gas emissions than all of transportation. It's estimated that 60% of all land capable of growing crops is used to grow feed for livestock. And this is happening at the same time that close to 1 billion people are going hungry. Some experts estimate that if we were to divert this feed to simply feed humans, that we could largely solve the problem of world hunger. About 1/3 of the Earth's freshwater supply goes towards animal agriculture, and over 90% of Amazonian deforestation is due to animal agriculture. It's also the leading cause of rainforest destruction, species extinction, ocean dead zones, and water pollution. Additionally, about 70% of the antibiotics produced globally go towards animal agriculture. And this is not only harmful to the animals that receive these antibiotics, but it's also a major cause of antibiotic resistance, which the World Health Organization identifies as one of the biggest threats to global health. Looking at this from a slightly different perspective, it requires 2 football fields worth of land to feed 1 person the standard American diet. And these same 2 football fields could feed 14 people eating a plant-based diet. Animal source foods are much more environmentally harmful than plant source foods, and red meat outpaces them all. In fact, the top 10 sources of greenhouse gas emissions in this chart come from animal source foods. There was a paper published in 2019 that sought to look at country-specific dietary shifts to mitigate climate change. And the authors of this paper concluded that shifting towards plant-forward diets is essential for meeting climate change mitigation targets and remaining within planetary boundaries. This graph shows a variety of dietary approaches to mitigate climate change in the United States. And you can see that there's a stepwise progression from left to right in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. One interesting finding is that a 2/3 vegan diet, or some people also call this a vegan before 6 diet, in which you essentially eat plant-based or vegan for the entire day and then have some flexibility to include animal foods at dinner time, had more of a positive impact than a lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet. And the reason for this is that many lacto-ovo-vegetarians will replace flesh foods with dairy foods. Another interesting thing that I wanted to point out, which is a diet that some of you may not have heard of. I hadn't heard about it until recently, which is a low food chain diet. And this is essentially, it's a plant-exclusive diet that only includes animal foods that are low on the food chain. So things like insects, low food chain fish, such as sardines and anchovies, as well as bivalve mollusks like clams and oysters. Some of you may have heard about the Eat Lancet Commission on Food, Planet, and Health. It's an international committee of experts from a variety of fields from around the world, and they sought to answer the question of, can we feed a future population of 10 billion people a healthy diet within planetary boundaries? And what this expert panel concluded is that food is the single strongest lever to optimize human health and environmental sustainability on Earth, and that a diet rich in plant-based foods and with fewer animal source foods confers both improved health and environmental benefits. So going back to the paper that I mentioned just a little bit ago, this dashed line represents the level of greenhouse gas emissions that we need to stay below in order to meet the planetary boundaries set by the Eat Lancet Commission. And you can see that the only 2 diets that meet this target are a low food chain diet and a vegan diet. And so as pediatricians, and I would say even climate activists, these are the diets that we should be aiming to eat. And I want to emphasize that as with many climate initiatives, it is not about being perfect and demanding perfection, but it's about increasing awareness and shifting towards positive change. As a whole, vegan diets have consistently been found to offer the greatest environmental protection and meet the UN's definition of sustainable diets. And while it's true that different foods will have varying environmental impacts in terms of land and water use, as a whole, vegan diets have been found to be the most protective. But even with diets that do contain animal foods, you can see that making a shift towards a more plant-based diet can have a dramatic positive impact. So usually when I speak about plant-based diets, I begin by talking about the health advantages and weave in climate change as an added benefit. But today I wanted to lead with climate and then just offer a little bit about the health effects, addressing 3 critical questions. Is it healthy? If so, what are the particular health advantages? Is it safe, especially for growing children? And do we as providers and potentially parents need to be concerned about specific nutrient deficiencies? And this could be a several series of hours long talk on these topics. So we won't have time to go into great depth, but I did want to provide a broad overview of these topics. So we've seen how food can impact climate, but food also has a tremendous effect on health. There's a strong link between diet and disease. In fact, diet is the single leading contributor to chronic disease and premature death. And 75% of all healthcare dollars in the United States are spent on chronic lifestyle-related diseases. It's estimated that 80% of heart attacks, 90% of type 2 diabetes cases, and 30 to 70% of cancers, as well as a whole host of other conditions from stroke, constipation, dementia, and so much more, are attributable to dietary risk factors. But I think there's a lot of confusion in terms of knowing what diet is really best for health. One minute, the headlines seem to be suggesting that cholesterol is bad for us, and the next minute, they're telling us that butter is back, and we should be eating it without any degree of concern. But when you look at the recommendations from the leading medical, public health, and dietetic association, you can see that there's actually quite a bit of consensus in terms of the main guidelines that define a healthy diet. And what these leading authorities tell us is that our diets should limit or exclude trans and saturated fats, heavily refined carbohydrates, and red and processed meats in the diet. And it should be rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds. Plant-based diets, research has shown that plant-based diets are associated with longevity and reduced all-cause mortality, a reduced risk of overweight and obesity, as well as lower rates of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, hypertension, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. The list goes on and on. In fact, plant-based diets are the cornerstone of health for some of the longest lived populations on the earth. The blue zones are geographical pockets located throughout the world in which they have the highest concentration of centenarians. So these are people that are living to age 100 and beyond in fairly reasonable health. And researchers wanted to know, what is the secret sauce? What allows these communities to enjoy such vibrant health? And they found that they actually had many shared characteristics. All of these communities tend to have a strong focus on family. They have low rates of smoking. They tend to be physically active. They're socially engaged in their communities. And when it comes to diet specifically, they all eat a plant-based diet and eat legumes or beans as a staple in their diet. There's a really wonderful short tutorial put out by the Harvard School of Public Health on sustainable diets, and I highly recommend that all of you check it out. It's free to take, and it takes about 10 minutes to go through the entire tutorial. And I think it's a really great primer for health professionals in terms of providing an overview of the issues, and it also leaves you with ways to have conversations with patients about this topic. This slide is a wonderful summary slide of their dietary recommendations. And again, you can see there's a strong emphasis on plant sources of food and a recommendation to limit animal source foods and heavily processed foods in the diet. There are two other papers that are a good resource on this topic. The first is entitled, "Can We Say What Diet is Best for Health?" And the second on plant-based diets for health promotion and sustainability. And the authors of the second paper concluded that the evidence is strong, consistent, and compelling that a diet of predominantly or even exclusively whole plant foods can promote health, selectively treat and reverse disease, and confer comparable benefit to the planet. What we should be eating then for disease reversal and health promotion for the sake of people and planet alike is clear enough. The truth is that we should all be eating plant-predominant diets. The what of future eating is not in question. The questions are all about how we get there from here. Data in children for many of these health conditions is limited, but knowing what we know about the impacts of diet on adult diseases, it would be reasonable to assume that starting these dietary patterns at a young age would be helpful. In terms of plant-based diets in children, children eating plant-based diets tend to have a lower risk of overweight and obesity. They've improved cardiometabolic profiles with lower cholesterol levels, and they have an overall improved quality of the diet. So kids that eat plant-based diets tend to eat more fruits and vegetables. They have higher fiber in their diet. They have a lower intake of saturated fat and sugar-sweetened beverages as well. But I think many parents and pediatricians, to be honest, are concerned that plant-based diets may not be appropriate for growing children. Recently, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is the world's leading professional dietetic association, put out a position statement to address this question. And what they say is that it is the position of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics that appropriately planned vegetarian diets, including total vegetarian or vegan diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits in the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. Well-planned vegetarian diets are appropriate for individuals during all stages of the life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, and for athletes. And this certainly doesn't mean that all children need to be 100% plant-based or vegan, but I think this position statement is important so that as pediatricians, when we're guiding families that may be eating this way, that we can provide them with adequate resources and support. But I think the place where most of us get stuck is on the words appropriately planned and well-planned, because what does that even mean? And are busy parents capable of providing their children with such well-planned diets? And I would argue that all diets for children need to be well-planned. In my own clinical practice, as I'm sure many of you can relate, I have treated children for rickets due to vitamin D deficiency, anemia due to iron deficiency, and growth failure due to inadequate calories. Nearly all of these patients were following an omnivorous diet. And I say this just to emphasize the fact that all diets for children need to be well planned, and these nutrients are also of concern for children that may be eating a plant-based diet. There have been several studies dating as far back as the 1980s and as recent as a few months ago that support the notion that appropriately planned plant-based diets can be safe for growing children. I think one thing I want to emphasize from much of these earlier studies, especially the ones that were done in the 1980s and 1990s, that showed inadequate growth or poor nutrient intake of vegan children, is that much of the early research focused on these communities that followed highly restrictive diets, such as macrobiotic or raw food only diets, which would not be appropriate for growing children, and even for most adults, I would argue. Of note, I wanted to mention two specific studies that were published in 2019 and 2021 out of Germany. And both of these studies document normal growth and adequate nutrient intakes in vegan and vegetarian children. There are, however, several nutrients for children eating a plant-based diet that we need to pay attention to. And children eating a plant-based diet do require certain fortified foods or supplements. But the notion that plant-based diets are inherently unsafe because they require fortification is completely illogical. In the United States, as in most parts of the world, our food systems are fortified to prevent nutrient deficiency in the population. So for instance, vitamin D has been added to milk to prevent rickets. We add iron to infant formula and cereals to prevent iron deficiency anemia. And we add we add iodine to salt to prevent goiters. So fortification is absolutely a necessary component of a healthy plant-based diet. So I won't have nearly enough time to talk about all the nutrients that you may be interested in, but I'm going to briefly talk about 4 of them. And the first is, of course, protein. This is probably the nutrient that I get asked most often about, but the one that I usually have the least amount of concern over. It's estimated that 97% of Americans meet their daily protein requirements, whereas less than 3% of Americans meet their daily fiber requirements. We largely overestimate our needs for protein. And in fact, the 2 most recent papers that I mentioned out of Germany both showed that vegan and vegetarian children consumed twice the reference intake for protein. So while some plants contain more or less of certain amino acids, actually all plants contain all 9 essential amino acids. It was previously believed that you had to combine foods with complementary amino acid profiles like rice and beans in order to make sure that we met our essential amino acid requirements. Rice and beans are a delicious combination, but the research does not show that you need to have complementary foods at each meal. We can meet our protein needs from infants through seniors by consuming a variety of foods and consuming enough calories. A lot of people also believe that animal foods contain a higher quality of protein based on the digestibility and distribution of essential amino acids. But a more modern approach to protein quality takes into account not only the amino acid profile, but also the impact of the food on human health and the environment. So while both plant and animal foods contain protein and micronutrients, animal sources of protein also contain cholesterol, saturated fat, hormones, and antibiotics. They require greater land and water use and cause animal suffering. Whereas plant proteins provide fiber, phytonutrients, antioxidants, they're more sustainable and compassionate. And this is a table that shows a variety of protein found in different foods. And you can see that plant foods like tofu and beans contain similar amounts of protein to animal foods that are thought to be good sources of protein, like beef, chicken, and fish. Veggie patties, lentils, and seeds are similar in protein to cheese, eggs, and yogurt. And the amount of protein in soy milk is very similar to that found in cow's milk. So oatmeal with nuts and seeds. Many of you might be hungry. I apologize if this is adding to it because it's getting close to lunchtime, or tofu stir fry, lentil soup, and even peanut butter toast offer delicious ways for us to meet our protein needs. Vitamin B12 is a critical nutrient for plant-based eaters. If you don't remember anything about any other nutrient, this is the one take-home message that I want to provide, because it's really an essential thing to know for those of your patients that may be following a plant-based diet. While B12 deficiency can take years to show up in adults, in infants it can happen in a matter of weeks to months. Symptoms of deficiency in infancy include weakness, irritability, anemia, lethargy, low muscle tone, developmental delay, failure to thrive, and even permanent brain injury. B12 is produced in bacteria and is found in meat, dairy, and eggs. Plant-based eaters are at increased risk of deficiency because plant foods are not a reliable source of B12. The bottom line is that getting adequate amounts of B12 is imperative. But the good news is that it's not difficult to obtain a reliable source of B12, either through consistent use of fortified foods or as a supplement. One last thing I wanted to mention about B12, many of you may not know this, but the Institute of Medicine actually recommends that for anyone over the age of 50, you should also be obtaining your B12 through fortified foods or as a supplement, because as we age, we have a decreased capacity to cleave B12 from its carrier protein on animal foods. So even if you eat an omnivorous diet over the age of 50, you should also be ensuring that you're getting either a B12 supplement or taking consistent B12 fortified foods. While B12 tends to be a nutrient that mostly plant-based eaters need to be concerned about, iron is a nutrient of universal concern. In fact, as I'm sure most of you know, it's the most common nutrient deficiency and the most common cause of anemia worldwide, regardless of the diet that's consumed. And within vegetarian populations, there can be quite a bit of variability in terms of iron status. Even though vegans and vegetarians tend to consume more iron than their omnivorous counterparts, they can experience somewhat higher levels of iron deficiency anemia because the iron from plant foods is not as bioavailable as it is from animal foods. And so a small increase in the RDA may be reasonable for some people. The richest sources of iron in plant foods are legumes, tofu, nuts, seeds, some vegetables, and fortified infant cereals, as well as meat analogs. And even, I think fortified infant cereals are a great way for plant-based children to meet their iron needs. Iron needs of infants ages 7 to 11 months are actually quite high, 11 milligrams per day. It's even higher than that of an adult male. So even if you have an omnivorous infant or toddler, it can be difficult for them to meet their iron needs without the use of iron fortified infant cereals or taking iron supplements. The key inhibitors of iron absorption are phytates, which are concentrated in bran, as well as whole grains, legumes, and polyphenolic compounds, such as those found in tea and coffee, as well as calcium. The most impressive enhancers of iron absorption are foods rich in vitamin C. Some studies have shown that pairing vitamin C, so like a squeeze of lemon on your beans, can increase iron absorption by as much as 30%. The last nutrient that I wanted to talk about is calcium. Most of us were conditioned to believe that milk does the body good, but the science to support this contention is weak. While calcium is a key nutrient for growing children, we don't require dairy to meet our calcium needs. There was a really terrific paper published in 2020 by Harvard researchers, and it was a comprehensive review on milk and health. And they looked at the current evidence as it relates to a variety of health outcomes, including bone growth, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and total mortality. And the authors concluded that increased intake is unlikely to provide substantial benefit, and harms are possible, such as breast and prostate cancer, asthma, eczema, and allergies. Additionally, because dairy cows are either pregnant or lactating, this can potentially lead to an increased exposure to sex hormones. Dairy products such as cheese and milk are also the main sources of saturated fat in the diet. We can obtain calcium and vitamin D from other sources without the use of dairy foods. Limiting dairy production could also make a major contribution towards reaching international greenhouse gas targets. And then finally, about 70% of the global population and upwards of 90% in some communities are lactose intolerant. So proclaiming dairy as a necessary food group is culturally insensitive and scientifically inaccurate. We could learn a lot from Canada's most recent food guide, which was released in 2019, in which they do away with the meat and milk category, and they replace it with protein-rich foods, which emphasize plant proteins. They also highlight water and not milk as the beverage of choice. This is a question that I get asked a lot about, so I wanted to briefly just provide this comparison chart. I think that the specifics of each plant-based milk are going to vary from brand to brand, but in this chart you can see that whole cow's milk, which is the standard milk recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics for kids under the age of 2, has more calories and fat than plant-based milks. And this is something to pay attention to, especially for toddlers that may be coming off of breast milk or formula. Fortified plant-based milks have similar amounts or more in some instances of calcium, iron, vitamins B12, and A and D. So don't be afraid of fortification. Soy milk and pea milk have similar amounts of protein to cow's milk, which makes them a really good choice, especially for toddlers. The other milks like almond, cashew, coconut, they tend to be much lower in calories as well as protein. So I would not recommend these other plant-based milks for young growing children. As children are getting older and they're getting the vast majority of their calories from food, you can have some more flexibility in terms of the type of milk that you choose, depending on availability and preference. But even with these other plant-based milks, I strongly encourage the use of fortified milks, especially for calcium. So I want to end by offering some practical tips and guidance to move forward while emphasizing that the journey does not have to be about sacrifice or tasteless food. Moving towards a plant-based diet can be filled with exciting flavor, delicious food, and an exploration of cultures and cuisines. So instead of focusing on what you might be giving up, focus on adding more plant-based foods to your diet. So keep everything the same, add some fresh fruit at breakfast, a cup of lentil soup with your sandwich, or a big salad at dinner. Go for the lowest hanging fruit. Make swaps that are easy and barely noticeable. So in my family, when we swapped out cow's milk with a variety of plant-based milks, it was fairly easy and nobody even really minded. Recreate family favorites to either replace the animal foods with plant foods or to cut the portions of the animal foods down. So beans instead of beef in your burrito, tofu instead of chicken in your stir fry, or even lentils instead of ground meat for a bolognese. Trust me, it works. You can recreate family, we already said that one. Okay, start with one meal at a time. Maybe just start at breakfast. So oatmeal with fresh berries, nuts, bacon instead of bacon and eggs, and then maybe move on to snacks and lunch. Alternatively, you could try a meatless Monday or vegan before 6. One thing that was particularly helpful for me when I was beginning to make this transition was that I was entirely plant-based at home, and then I gave myself some flexibility if I was attending a conference or going out to dinner. I think it's really important to find a sense of community, either virtually or in person, to gain inspiration and to learn about plant-based cooking. This is going to seem like a really trivial step, but one of the most impactful things that I found was just packing a plant-based lunch to take to work. People would come up to me and tell me how healthy or delicious or tasty it looked, and it can be really a starting point for conversation and for inspiration. When you're feeling more comfortable, offer to bring a plant-based option to potlucks or gatherings. Invariably, I find it's the first dish to disappear, and people are always asking for the recipe. We can also talk to patients and families about ways in which they can start to incorporate more plant-based plants into their diets and be a source of compassionate, reliable, evidence-based care. We can also work on creating a plant-based by default option at work and professional meetings, especially ones that talk about the climate crisis. If your organization or workplace isn't ready to go fully plant-based, you can work towards making the plant-based option the default option, and meals that include animal products become the special diet. I'm so used to ordering the special diet everywhere I go. And we can also advocate to have more plant-based options in our cafeterias and our inpatient settings as well. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, focus on joy, connection, and positive progress. You know, the climate crisis is real. There's no single cause and there's no single cure. It is undeniable that animal agriculture is a significant contributor. It might not be within our individual capacity to assemble a government that acknowledges and prioritizes the environment, to influence corporations, to innovate new forms of transportation, energy, and technology. All of these things are going to be necessary, but innovation and political change require time, persistence, and a strong collective will. And we can be a part of the global solution in both small and big ways. One final resource I wanted to leave you with, for those of you that might be interested in reading more about this topic, is a terrific book by Jonathan Safran Foer called We Are the Weather, Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast. And in it, he says that every time we say crisis, we are also saying decision, and that humankind takes leaps when individuals take steps. This quote summarizes his book nicely, and I think is the perfect place for us to end. He says that changing how we eat will not be enough on its own to save the planet, but we cannot save the planet without changing how we eat. Thank you for your time.
Hi, I would just like to say thank you for the best talk on this subject that I've ever heard. It was really compelling. And I do get asked by patients a lot for resources when we get talking about healthy nutrition, and particularly in the younger children. And I'm wondering if out of the many resources that you've brought to our attention today, if you have some good recommendations for us.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think that, as pediatricians, we're so busy, and to be able to have those few resources right at our fingertips. And I think you also want to be very careful with what you're recommending, because in some ways you're sort of endorsing what they say. And sometimes even within the vegan and plant-based community, there can be an over-exaggeration of certain health benefits. And so my advice is to sort of stay the middle ground, say what we know for sure, and the last thing we want to do is to spread misinformation. There's a terrific website called veganhealth.org. And the thing that I like about this particular website, it's run by a couple of dietitians, and it's really about just presenting the data. It's not up to me or anyone else to convince a parent about being plant-based or being vegetarian or being vegan. It's about providing the evidence and the data. When the data says we have these positive health outcomes, when the data says we don't have enough information, and when the data says these are some potential areas of concern. So people, often I see, especially on social media, people say, eat, a whole foods vegan diet and it'll solve all your health problems. That's not the case. We still have to pay attention. And our job as pediatricians is to allow our patients to be successful and confident. So veganhealth.org, you can look it up by nutrient or topic, and it'll give you, it's very well referenced. At the bottom, it'll give you all the references that they include. Obviously, I thought that there was such a lack of information for pediatricians that we wrote a whole book about it. So and on our website, actually, there's more resources too that are free. So those are the two places that I would start.
Hi, thank you for that. I wanted to ask some questions from our virtual audience.
Oh, okay.
So one question is, could you please comment on phytoestrogens in soy and other plant-based foods, and if you recommend a limit, particularly if there's a gender difference in recommendations?
Yes, and this is a question that probably protein and soy are the two most common questions that I get. So what I would say is that soy foods are not required for a plant-based vegan diet. So for some reason, if you've got an allergy to soy or some other health issues that would prevent you from consuming soy, you can absolutely do it without including soy. Having said that, for someone who's not allergic, I have no concerns about including a couple of servings of soy a day. Some of the research that looked at specifically gynecomastia in males and other estrogenizing effects, they were based on 2 case reports, and these individuals were consuming 15 to 20 servings of soy and the soy isolate proteins, the highly processed soy. So definitely don't give your kids 15 to 20 servings of soy, but with 2 to 3 servings of soy is perfectly healthy. And in fact, when you look at countries that have the highest consumptions of soy, they have lower rates of breast and prostate cancer. Soy foods are one of the most health promoting foods. And I would say my 2 recommendations would be to try to, get as much of the less processed soy foods. So I think some of the veggie meats and stuff are fine. They're perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But if you stick to things like soy milk, tofu, tempeh, edamame, a couple of servings of those a day absolutely should not be a problem. I would not go more than, 3 to 4. I mean, average it out over the course of the week, but a couple of servings a day is perfectly healthy, and especially soy milk for toddlers, it's a great way for them to be able to meet their protein needs. And so yeah, I don't think unless you have a specific health reason, there is a need to exclude soy foods in the diet.
I was thinking about how do we combat some of the challenges presented by disorderly eating patterns and how plant-based diets can sometimes be a mask for some of those patterns.
Okay, I'm going to give you the short answer, and then I'm going to step off because I want to be respectful of the next presenter's time. The short answer is that studies looking at the relationship between vegetarian and vegan diets and disordered eating, the highest rates of eating disorders are actually amongst semi-vegetarians. So these are people who eat meat sometimes and not other times. And because that can be a mask for, am I not eating this food because I have an eating disorder? Or am I not eating this food because of my ethics and value? Those people that are committed to this way of eating because of their ethics and values, the rates of eating disorders are about the same as the general population. So I think the main thing to ask is why? Why are you eating? And I always do, one last thing I'll say is the cupcake test. If I gave you a vegan cupcake, would you eat it? And that can sort of give you a little bit of information about their intentions and motivations, but I'm happy to chat more about it. Thank you so much for your time.